Good afternoon and good morning on the West Coast, and thank you for joining and welcome to our Roundtable, Education, Enforcement, and Action, the State of Graduated Driver's License Laws. As many of you know, I'm Nicholas Worrell. I'm the Chief of the NTSB Safety Advocacy Division, and I want to thank my team, especially Brian Delaney, for pulling together our Teen Driver Safety Week activities and events to help raise awareness of teen driver safety. There's nothing like a young, passionate, motivated leader, and we have that in Brian. He joined our agency on August 30th, and he knows teen driver safety far better than an old man like me. Although he is new to the NTSB, he has built relationships in the highway safety community for years, including his time at NOIS, SAD, and FCCLA. You might recognize him from his Road Safety at Rush Hour, the podcast he produced and hosted as the communications coordinator for the American Highway Users Alliance. He is the future of transportation safety. So welcome, Brian, and thank you for your part in pulling this great esteemed panel together. Some of you may know Steve Blackenstone, our moderator today, who managed NTSB state and local government affairs program. Before we get started with Steve, I want to thank him too, not just for this roundtable, but for this job that I'm currently in. Steve was the man who hired me at NTSB, and I'll just say, sometime last century. We have Steve for a few more weeks before he retires at the end of this year after 48 years in government. 48 years, that's a long time. As you can imagine, the loss will be keenly felt. But before he rides off into the sunset, we convince him to moderate this graduated driver's license and roundtable. Steve has done a tremendous amount of work to get our current GDL laws enacted that we just couldn't let him walk away without weighing in on his input on GDL this last go around. Most of you who tuned in today are probably not teen drivers, although teen safety advocates from SAD and FCCLA might be watching. Maybe some of them will make the transition as Brian did from youth safety advocates to professional transportation safety advocates. We all hope that by the time they're nearing retirement age, there are caretakers of a system that has achieved, that has and will help achieve the goal of zero traffic deaths and zero serious injuries. But job one is to keep more of them alive until that day. At this stage of life, and for many years after, traffic crashes will be a leading cause of death for each and every one of them. We are meeting virtually today because of the pandemic, observing the distancing rules that will save lives. Don't get me wrong now, COVID has been and continues to be a safety risk to more teens than you think. But fighting COVID is more likely to save older folks like Steve and me more than teens or younger folks like Brian. So I feel like telling our teens what people used to say to me when I was in the Marines. Thank you for your service. They have made unprecedented changes to their lives, largely for the benefit of elders. We owe it to them to take care of them in their time of need. For example, the most dangerous first year of driving. For you driver educators, you are on the front lines, masked up in closed quarters alongside your learners, then wiping down the cars between drivers and taking all of today's precautions. And suddenly, you are not only educators, you are on the front lines. Thank you for your service as well. Teens who have taken an effective driver's ed course can gain the skills and knowledge for safe driving. So your work has a powerful, positive impact when they need it most. For any parent and caregivers tuned in today, driver's education can only teach your young driver students so much. They still need practice, and that's where you come in. Until that stressful day that you hand over the keys for their first solo drive. For any lawmakers tuned in, I want to ask you to think about all our teens. First, think about when you were a teen. Think back to that one experience we all have in common. Can you remember when you handed over the keys of your first vehicle, when you were handed the keys of your first vehicle, or tuned the engine or turned the engine while under the supervision of an adult? Well, I remember. It was a 16-valve VW Scirocco, and it had a lot of power, and I loved that little black car. Well, my mom might have been nervous every time I gave her a ride to the store or to the supermarket, but realize how diverse our teens are as well. You see, my mom wasn't teaching me to drive because she did not have a driver's license herself, and she still does not have one to this day. That's the case for many inner city kids. We are first generation drivers in families that are more used to public transportation. Where does that fit into the GDL system? And finally, realize that no issue as big for teens is as big for teens as driving, because the prospect of death or serious injury on the road is so real for them. Let me say that again. No issue is as big for our teens as safe operation of a motor vehicle. Let's approach the topic of teen driver safety with that mindset. GDL laws included. In 2019, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, 2,042 people were killed in crashes involving teen drivers. These crash deaths do not have to happen. They're all preventable, and effective GDL programs are a big part of preventing it. So I, for one, I'm excited to get our discussion started. The state of graduated driver license laws. Where are we now? Where must we go with this very important component of our teen drivers? Steve, take it away, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick, and I very much appreciate those kind words. And let me ask the other panelists to turn on their videos and their microphones now. I very much appreciate the opportunity to dig into this important issue today, because it is, as Nick said, critical to the future of our youth. NTSB has been working on graduated driver and teen safety issues virtually throughout its existence since the 1960s. Our earliest recommendations for improving driver education date back to 1968. In 1982, we recommended that states raise the minimum drinking age to 21 as a means of reducing impaired driving crashes among young drivers. Our first recommendation regarding graduated driver licensing came in 1993, which was supplemented with a call to add a passenger restriction in 2002 and to prohibit cell phone use by provisional drivers in 2003. Regarding driver education, we've made recommendations calling for specific enhancements in that area, again, virtually since our very beginning of our existence. Following a two-day forum in 2003, we asked the U.S. Department of Education to identify the best educational strategies and to work with NHTSA to develop best practices for driver education. We're still working to improve those best practices today, and I hope that our conversation will indeed lead to some further ideas in that regard. Let me start by introducing our panelists today, and we do have an exciting group of people with us. First is Dr. Becca Wiest, who's a research scientist with the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, where she focuses her work on teenage drivers so that she'll be able to bring to us up-to-date information on the research in this area. Pam Fisher is a senior director for external engagement at Governor's Highway Safety Association. Previously, she was the highway safety representative in New Jersey and worked for many years there with AAA. She's going to be able to bring us, I think, an outstanding perspective from the state level, and particularly in a state that's been a leader in this area. Kenny Bragg is a highway investigator with the NTSB. Previously, he served with the Prince George's County, Maryland Police Department. Tara Gill is the Senior Director of Advocacy and State Legislation with Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety. and has extensive experience working in the states lobbying on behalf of highway safety legislation. Dr. Bill Van Tassel, who's manager of driver training programs at AAA National, will be able to bring us a perspective in that area. And then finally, of course, Nick will be part of our discussion also. Unfortunately, Benny Malberg, president of the Official Driving School, was scheduled to be with us today, but he's had to cancel at the last minute due to a family emergency. And we certainly send our best wishes to him as he deals with that issue. Today, we're going to dig into two separate but interrelated issues: graduated driver licensing systems and driver education. We all know the numbers. As Nick said, traffic crashes are a leading cause of death and serious injury among young adults. Teen drivers have crash rates nearly 4 times those of adults aged 20 and older. And as Nick said, in 2019, almost 2,400 teenagers died from crash injuries. That rate declines rapidly with each passing year of age until people reach their mid-20s. So this really is a high-risk age that we're dealing with. We know developmentally that teens are more likely to engage in risky behavior. That, combined with their inexperience behind the wheel, means that young drivers don't recognize hazards as well, and they don't know best how to respond to them when they do recognize them. So today we're going to be looking at this challenge. How do we address this very risky, peculiar situation? I'd like to start by asking Kenny Bragg to talk a little bit about to flesh out the numbers of some of his experiences, both at NTSB and his prior law enforcement career, about what the world is like for teenage drivers and what graduated licensing has meant in Maryland.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, ironically enough, I became a police officer in 1993, at the same time the NTSB made their first GDL license recommendations. And through that experience, I've come in contact with a number of teen drivers throughout various situations on the road. In 2000, I began doing fatal crash investigations. And from 2000 to 2013 until I retired, I did approximately 238 fatal crash investigations. And I can tell you on a personal level, there's nothing that's more heartbreaking than going to someone's home at 2 o'clock in the morning and tell them that their most precious person they know has died as a result of some foolish mistake. The one good thing that GDL has brought, it has caused parents to become more involved in educating their kids in driver's licensing. So it is definitely a good thing. It saves lives, and I hope this trend continues.
Thanks, Kenny. I think, Kenny, also you were involved in your work in Prince George's County at the time that Maryland passed its graduated driver licensing statute. Is that right? Absolutely.
During that, leading up to that point, there was a rash of young high school students getting killed, and most often they were driving a car that was probably too fast for their ability, and the parents were just giving them the car and sending them out into the wild. But the GDL program has caused parents to become involved. It makes the kids more responsible, it makes them accountable for their actions by taking their license in instances that they do something foolish, or even making sure that they're good students. So this had a very positive impact on the kids' driving behavior.
Thanks. As a foundation, let me just lay out sort of a basic understanding of what graduated driver licensing laws are so that we all are speaking from the same perspective. A comprehensive graduate licensing system is a 3-stage process. First is a learner's permit that allows only driving while accompanied by an adult. Then, after successful completion of that, the driver moves into an intermediate phase where he can drive while unsupervised with certain restrictions, such as limits on passengers or late night driving or cell phone use, and varying, depending on the state, varying other restrictions. And then finally, the applicant receives full licensure only upon successful completion of both of the earlier phases. So for example, if a young driver gets a ticket during that intermediate phase for any sort of traffic violation, he then would start that period all over again. So with that understanding, I want to turn to Becca and ask Dr. Wiest if she could give us a brief update on what is the current status of state graduated driver's licensing laws. Becca, I think your mic is turned off.
And we thought this was going smoothly. Hi, everyone. So the state of graduated driver licensing laws is actually very similar to the state. The state of it now is very similar to the state a year ago and 2 years ago and 3 years ago, because they've kind of stalled out. The last real movement that we saw on significant kind of components of graduated driver licensing was around 2015. So the IHS website has a graduated driver licensing calculator that allows people to go in and kind of estimate the reduction in fatal crashes and insurance claim dollars, basically, that could occur if states adjusted their graduated licensing provisions to the strongest standards across the country. And we have, I think, only updated it once since 2015. It's been quite a while. So there's been movement on other things, but specifically cell phone laws targeting everybody and teenagers specifically. But the political will around graduated licensing has slowed significantly.
What are the most significant gaps in state laws now?
Well, it kind of depends on the state. So there are 5 specific provisions that we keep track of, and we think about cell phone use and electronic device use separately than graduated licensing, so I won't discuss those. But we consider, and let me bring up our website. But we consider the age at which teens can get their permit and their license, the length of time, the minimum length of time that they have to hold their permit, and then the nighttime travel restrictions and passenger restrictions, and the number of supervised practice driving hours that teens have to do when they are in their permit stage with a parent or a licensed adult. And there are strongest standards kind of across the country, where nighttime restrictions start at sunset or at 8 or 9 p.m. And teen passengers specifically are limited to 0, and teens can get their permit at, say, age 17. And no state has all of the strongest provisions, and I believe the most any state has is 2 out of the 5. So the gaps really kind of depends on the state as well. States with bigger rural space basically will have different kind of priorities about graduated licensing and the things that are important than states with a bigger urban landscape.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to note that no state has all of the ideal provisions for graduated driver licensing. In every state, while all states have some form of graduate driver license, in every state there's a need for improvement. So yes. You made an important comment there, which I'd like to ask others to flesh out a little bit, and that is the lack of political will to take further action on graduated driver licensing. A couple of our panelists have spent a lot of time in the trenches working in state legislatures, trying to get states to strengthen their laws. And I'd like to ask both Tara and Pam if they might take a few minutes and talk. First of all, what sort of overall is the political scene in state legislatures? What's important to state legislators these days? And where does traffic safety fall within that scale?
Yeah, if Pam, if you don't mind me kicking it off,
go for it,
happy
Tara.
to jump
go
in.
for it.
Okay,
it's fine.
Thank you.
I'm not going to be quiet, but you start.
All right.
Please don't. I want this to be an interactive discussion and not an interview.
Sure, I'll kick it off. But I just wanted to go back and, before I forget, give a shout out to IHS for their GDL calculator. Mm-hmm. I love the GDL calculator. I use it all the time when I'm putting together letters for state legislators or fact sheets, or it's a super talking point to be able to go to the calculator and say, hey, if you added this law or made an improvement to this provision of your GDL program, here are the estimated benefits. So it's a super resource, and I hope folks know about it and use it. And going back to what's going on in state legislatures, I think it's a 2-part thing. The first part is regarding GDL laws. I think there's a misconception in states that they took care of it, you know, and that happened before I came onto the scene to work on GDL laws, like in the late 90s, early 2000s. There was a lot of momentum to, you know, establish GDL programs. And then after that, it's sort of, as Rebecca mentioned, it kind of just, you know, fizzled out a little bit. I've been covering advocates state programs since 2015, and there have maybe been a handful of GDL upgrades in that time, and I'm including those for the, you know, cell phone bans as well in that. And the most recent being the upgrade in South Dakota in 2020, which was, you know, a fantastic improvement to the law. And we hope that more states will take notice of South Dakota's actions, and it will motivate them to rethink, to take a fresh look at their own GDL laws and motivate action. But I think, you know, the general state of play in state legislatures is really difficult now. It's challenging to get you know, a significant traffic safety law across the finish line. It often takes multiple sessions, well-organized, large coalitions, which, you know, everybody on this panel knows about because we've all worked together in some fashion in, you know, as part of those state coalitions to move the needle on safety. So when you couple that with perhaps the misconception that GDL laws have been taken care of, I think that, you know, sort of talks to the lack of momentum that's going on right now.
I couldn't agree more with what Tara said. You know, I worked New Jersey's law for many years. I was on the front lines when we originally got our graduated driver's license law passed. I mean, I'm going to date myself by saying that it was signed into law by Christy Whitman. That's how far back I go. I mean, that's a ways back. And it took effect in 2001. And then we didn't see any significant changes to our law again until 2008, 2009. And what happened, unfortunately, what often happens and where you get some momentum is that there are fatal crashes. So we had a rash in 2006 of fatalities involving students, you know, driving with multiple passengers. And all of a sudden someone said, hey, wait a minute, what's going on? We have this law, but what's happening? And we were very quick to say, well, we need to do better. We know from the research that, you know, things have changed and we need to move forward and strengthen the law. So we were able to get momentum. We had a teen driver study commission. I had the privilege of chairing that group, and we put together a comprehensive report and said, these are the kinds of things we need to do. So we were fortunate that we got some of those provisions to put into law, and it really helped a lot. And we've seen our numbers come down. But what happened after that, and we also saw a number of other states also looking at their laws and making some changes in that decade. But then we hit, you know, 2011, 12, 13, and very little happened. And I call it GDL fatigue. That's what I refer to it as. The legislature was like, wait a minute, we've been talking about teens for the past decade. We fixed the problem. It's okay. We don't need to look at this anymore. And we said, but we haven't fixed the problem. You know, we all know this. I mean, we're kind of preaching to the choir here, but, you know, the legislative process and getting laws changed, we have to make a lot of compromises. We don't always get what we want the first time out of the gate. So we have to continue to go back and say, there's new science, there's new information, that the tool that, you know, Rebecca mentioned, I use it too. It's a fantastic tool. And I talk about it every time I go out and work with the state to say, are you looking at what you can do to make gains in safety? So we've got to continue we've got to beat on this. I mean, we need the legislature to understand that we have to do more. And I will use, you know, I won't belabor the point, but I was just, yesterday I went online because a group of individuals and organizations came together in my state of New Jersey and said, we still need to pass a practice hours portion of our GDL law. We've been trying to get that passed since 2008. To me, it's a no-brainer. Why hasn't it been included in our GDL law? We're one of 3 states that still doesn't have a minimum standard of practice hours. And it makes no sense to me, but here we are. And we're saying to the legislature, look, this can really make a difference. Parents are looking for guidance. That's what the GDL program really is. It's a parent program that gives them minimum standards to aim for, to protect their teens as they go out there and do the most dangerous thing they're going to do probably in their lifetime. So we need to continue to educate the legislature. We need to use tools like the IHS calculator, which is fantastic. And we need to work together. The more we can bring coalitions and groups of people together, advocates, AAA, the highway safety offices, work with parents, work with teens. Their teen voices need to be heard as well. I think the more effective we can be and hopefully start to move the needle. But it has been incredibly difficult because, as I said, the legislature thinks the job is done, and it's not.
Yeah, let me just add to that a little bit of my own experience. And that is, as you say, legislators don't like to come back and revisit an issue. They want to do it once and be done with it, even if they have to, as you say, often compromise and accept only partial measures. The political reality is there are two sides to every argument. There's somebody who's going to oppose everything, no matter what it is, and you've always got to confront that reality. Another point is, over and over and over again, what I have seen, and you alluded to this, Pam, is that tragedies sadly make a difference. Legislators often are not motivated until there's a horror story that forces them to move. And it's an unfortunate reality of our political process, but often that's the case. I remember many years ago, there was a series of high visibility teen crashes in Illinois, which led to the Secretary of State creating a task force on which I served that met throughout the year and came up with a rather extensive program that led to changes in the law. So that sort of thing over and over and over again is what we see making a difference.
Yeah, Connecticut had the same thing, Steve. Connecticut put a task force together actually right before we did in New Jersey because they had a series of crashes and they were able to make some significant changes to their GDL law that really have made a difference. They're one of the states, one of a handful of states that have a parent education requirement, which I think is vital. And it's not necessarily something that you're seeing across the country, but parents need to understand graduated driver's licensing. They're the first line of defense in terms of enforcing the provisions of this law. They need to understand the risk for their teens. And so I applaud Connecticut and in Rhode Island, and I think Massachusetts and Minnesota has a provision, and Montana. And then there's, I think one county in Virginia that still has a pilot program they've had for years, which we appreciate, but we need to do more also to think about that component. And we tried to pass that provision in New Jersey when we originally moved other changes to our law and haven't been successful. So we've kind of done a workaround with that. But, there are just some really key things that can be done that can make a huge difference in terms of saving lives. And it's not just teens that are impacted by these crashes, it's all other road users.
Steve?
The other important, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to jump in and comment on two things that were mentioned. The first one is you were mentioning, and Pam too, that sometimes action is only occurs if there's a tragedy. And well, the data for 2020 isn't out. Just on a quick Google search of 2020 teen driver crashes, fatalities, I mean, just story after story came up in states about teen driver crashes and fatalities going up in 2020. So, that's consistent with the increases we've seen sort of across the board. So, I think it provides an opportunity, a very sad opportunity, to make the case for revisiting these GDL laws. And the second part is I wanted to throw in my street cred as a mom of 2 novice drivers right now, which is not an enviable position at all.
God bless you, Tara.
Thank you. Thank you. Reminder to everybody out there, don't have 2 kids within 2 years. You're going to be teaching them to drive at the same time. So, I just wanted to say that even in my own experience with my background and knowing, what I do about teen driving and GDL programs, you know, I can confirm that it can be fraught at times, and it takes education. We live in Washington, D.C., and I had to tease out, you know, what are the GDL laws in D.C., and, you know, what is it going to take to comply with them? And then knowing what I know about teen driver safety and GDL programs, what are the best practices that I want to layer on top of that? You know, GDL provisions, when states pass them, they're not the ceiling, they're the basement, you know, and then it requires parents to be an active partner in making those determinations about their own child's readiness. You know, your state may say, well, we have a 6-month learners period, but if you get to the end of that 6 months and you're not confident in your child's, you know, level of responsibility or the skill they've gained in 6 months, they shouldn't transition to independent driving. So, you know, I think the GDL programs and the provisions are, you know, enormously helpful to educate parents and, you know, just to set a level that parents can then build on top of.
Tara, I think you made a really good point. Just in my years in enforcement, I've always been amazed at the level of non-engagement some parents had. I remember one parent in particular, and this wasn't a fatal crash, but they bought their 16-year-old a sports car, and was surprised when he got pulled over doing 100 miles per hour. You know, I mean, we really have to make it a priority for our parents, not only our parents, for our law enforcement community. I mean, law enforcement have a lot of competing priorities right now, and I'm afraid that this issue gets put on the back burner and never gets addressed again. But it still continues to be very important.
So how do we get it off the back burner onto the front burner?
We have to
gotta
engage.
educate. Yeah.
Yeah, we have to
Go
engage
ahead.
communities like the IACP. I mean, they, you know, they're the forefront of the law enforcement community nationwide. So, you know, there's organizations that we can engage and we can promote this education to, and we can affect a change.
Yeah, and let me add this too, Steve. I think it's really important. Law enforcement is challenged. They've got tons and tons of law in the books that they have to enforce. And they're going to obviously, you know, defer to the riskiest behaviors that are putting people at risk out there. We found in my state, and we've shared this with other states in New Jersey, law enforcement didn't really understand the GDL law and how it worked. And they also didn't understand the overall risk for teens. And so we developed a free training program developed by a law enforcement official. Arnold Anderson is his name, great person who just left New Jersey and retired to Florida. So I hope he continues his work down there. And it really is, it's called GDL for law enforcement. And it really is about understanding the risk for teens, why they are risky drivers, the brain development issue, you know, inexperience, explains the provisions of the law and why they're in place. It points to research from IIHS and the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and other groups that have looked closely at this issue. And it really helps them understand why it is so important to get out there and be cognizant of this and to enforce those when you see teens violating them. And what we've seen is the officers have gone through this program. It's like the light bulbs go off. Oh my gosh, I get it. I understand. Because again, let's go back to they're challenged by knowing so many other statutes on the books, coupled with they didn't get this kind of training in the police academy. There's a limited amount of time and information. So we need to supplement this. We need to help law enforcement officers understand the magnitude of this problem and the law and how it works, and give them the tools they need to do that enforcement. That's really, really important.
Steve, I just want, oh.
Go ahead.
Okay, if I could jump in, I just wanted to add too that, you know, we see pursuing legislation, whether it's new legislation or an upgrade to existing legislation, as an opportunity to educate as well. You know, from the materials you're going to be submitting to committees and leadership in the legislature to media engagement that's going to take place. You know, you have this opportunity to discuss the issue, to share new research, to make your case for why it's so important to make these changes. And even if the effort in that session is not successful, it's still a means of getting the message out there and laying the groundwork for the next session to come back.
So let me suggest one other thought, and that is that the police in particular, but I think the community at large, responds to what are the political priorities. And in my experience, rarely, if ever, has traffic safety been a top political priority for a politician. You don't hear campaign commercials about politicians running because of their traffic safety background, with one or two exceptions that I can think of. And that I think, I mean, the law enforcement community reacts to their political leadership. They're going to do what their bosses want them to do, in essence. And likewise, I think families often are going to respond to more culturally than politically, but are going to respond to what they're seeing in the culture, and that's not what they're seeing. Traffic safety just isn't a political, cultural priority. And the question I keep asking is, well, how do we make it? How do we make it that? And I don't know that there is an answer, that in part because there are a lot of other really large, tough issues out there that leaders are dealing with these days. So I want to turn for a second to Bill with AAA, because AAA has been a real leader and catalyst in the graduated driver licensing movement since its very beginning. Early on, in the 1990s even, AAA's leadership was saying, this is a priority that we're going to make top part of our agenda. And and I know Pam Fisher worked with AAA as well prior to her work in the state. Shout out to all of the AAA clubs around the country that have just done a phenomenal job in trying to build this political priority that I'm talking about. So, but appreciate you sharing your experiences or the AAA perspective.
Sure. Yeah, GDL has been a top priority issue for AAA for years, and we're proud of our contributions along the way. There's a lot of fights with so many jurisdictions, so many states to work, and fortunately, we have people on the ground in all of those locations to work that, and we have been. And to an earlier point, I think it's still a priority for us. And in a lot of states, it's mainly fine tuning now, trying to get the rest of the components there across the finish line, rather than going from 0 to 1. We're trying to incrementally improve there and make things more consistent nationally. AAA has, of course, a number of other legislative priorities, child passenger safety and safety belts, but GDL is still way up there, and we're, as a traffic safety community, we're making progress, but there's some more steps to accomplish yet.
Great. Well, thanks. Yes, there is, as we've talked about, still a lot more to go. What do you think are looking forward to the future, what are the changes that might be the most significant increments to graduated driver licensing? Are the things we should be looking forward to changes down the road in light of changed environment, and change vehicles and change roadways and that sort of thing?
I go back to two of the bread and butter provisions of graduated driver's licensing that the research has clearly shown have made a huge difference, and that's passenger restrictions and nighttime driving restrictions. We know when we can get those multiple passengers out of the vehicle that the crash risk is going to drop significantly. The potential or the possibility of engaging in risky behaviors goes down significantly. And the nighttime driving piece is tremendously important. So if we can start to make some new inroads in that area, I think that's vitally important. And we have a lot of work to do. Not only do we need states to say we need to limit the passengers, but some of the states, the provisions that are in effect make it very difficult for law enforcement to really, really enforce these provisions. We have states where for the first 3 months, there's no passengers, and the next 3 months you can have 1 passenger, and then the next 3 months you can have, and it's just crazy. It's very, very complicated, making it difficult for law enforcement and parents to know what they're supposed to do. So that's important. And we know that when we get teens off the road at an earlier hour, it also makes a significant difference. And we have many, many states that have restrictions or curfews that don't start until after midnight. And that is a problem because we see, more crashes happening in darkness. And I'm going to say this not only as a traffic safety professional, as an advocate, but I'm going to say it as a mom. I was there too, like Tara, only one though. And I lived through this experience. And, my son was an ice hockey player. So he often had games that went late. He had practices. And I knew that it was my job to get him off the road and not allow him to drive. And the first time he had his license and he was able to drive independently, I said to him, you have a game this weekend. It starts at 9 o'clock. Our nighttime driving restriction kicked in at 11 and he wasn't ready for that. But I said, I will take you to get the bus and I will be there to meet you after the bus and bring you home. But Mom, I can drive. And I said, but you can't drive after 11 o'clock. And my rule is you have to be off the road even before that. And he had a fit. And I said, tough luck. And, but, my job as a parent was to really make sure that he complied with those provisions. And I also knew that he wasn't ready for, after 9, 10 o'clock at night. He just wasn't ready for that. So if we can make some additional inroads in the nighttime driving and the passenger restrictions, that would be tremendously, I think, helpful. And I think we'd continue to see the numbers drop. And I want to throw this out there and then I'll stop. But I truly believe if there's one group of road users that we can get to zero, it's teens. I mean, I've seen the numbers fall tremendously because of graduated driver's licensing. I truly believe we can get to zero with this group, but it's going to take all of us working together and it's going to take the strongest laws possible to make that happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Pam just said. But I wanted to add another concept on top of that, and that's, the role that technology can play in preventing crashes. And I may call Becca in because IIHS has done some terrific research in this realm where they've shown that advanced driver assistance systems, the crash avoidance technologies can prevent or mitigate a really good percentage of crashes. And they just did recent research showing that this is applicable to teen crashes as well. So, Advocates has been and continues to push for these proven systems as, standard equipment on new vehicles supported by a minimum performance standard, because, we absolutely want the types of technology that perform the best, that detect and respond to pedestrians. And also, regardless of the vehicle type or the model you get, it should adhere to, again, setting that basement. It should be able to do at least a minimum, adhere to a minimum standard. So we really think that the vehicle safety technologies are going to be an absolute game changer moving forward, especially when coupled with GDL law improvements.
I love all of that, Tara. And I think it's important. I mean, it becomes an entire other conversation when you get into vehicle choice for teens, because it is definitely a choice that parents make. And I think a lot of parents make that decision for their teen before they realize that that's what they're doing, because about half of teens that get a car that they are the primary driver of get a hand-me-down car from somewhere in their family. It was a car that their parents bought as a family vehicle, 5 to 10 years before that kid started driving. So if you have a 5-year-old, you're potentially buying a car that the 5-year-old is going to drive when they're a teenager. And, that we've found across, several studies. We did one that was published in 2015, and I think CHOP has done one more recently in New Jersey, finding that, the most vulnerable road populations are the populations that are in less expensive and usually older and less well-equipped cars. That includes teens and older drivers. And so, as time goes on and, efforts to make things like automatic emergency braking and blind spot monitoring and lane keeping standard on vehicles, like as those progress, they'll start showing up in less expensive and more used vehicles with more availability. But right now we're in this interesting place where it's still just, an issue of economics. So I I like to point out to people that, like, yes, if you think that your teen is going to be safer in a car with features like that, then, and you have the ability to put them in a car like that, like, go for it. Two things. One, you can only teach your teen to use a car like that if you know how to use it. So, and we find a lot of adults who have vehicles that are equipped with those features maybe don't know the parameters. Like, maybe they know that it's there and they use it, but they don't quite know how it works and what the limits are. For example, does your automatic emergency braking stop for pedestrians? Do you know? At what speed does it stop for pedestrians? Because most of them struggle with pedestrians and things that are not car shaped. And most of them will only do it below a certain speed. And knowing the limits of your system allows you to, first of all, drive safely with them and model safe driving with them. And second of all, teach somebody else to drive safely with them. So yes, they can make your teen safer. Absolutely. We've seen this in the research, but there are many components that go into this. And then if you're not in a position to put your teen in a car with those features, there are still safer choices that you can make for your teenager that are affordable. So I feel like there's kind of an all or nothing attitude sometimes, like, oh, I can't put my kid in the safest car possible, so I'm going to put them in whatever I can afford. And, you know, we, the Institute, we publish a list of recommended vehicles for teenagers that, you know, focus on a couple of key parameters like horsepower. You don't put a teen in a high horsepower car, like that teen in the sports car, and then be surprised when they speed. You know,
Goes back to Kenny's anecdote.
Yeah, so we recommend cars based on a few different parameters like horsepower and size. We don't recommend like micro or mini cars. We do recommend a couple of small cars because teens and families tend to lean in that direction. So we've started adding those to our list. And then we don't recommend like the very large ones because they're less maneuverable and it's harder to, you know, develop an awareness of where the car is in space. You know, equipped with the very basics like electronic stability control is a must, and, you know, having the highest safety rating possible. So yeah. For parents who are making choices about cars that they want to drive and they have, you know, elementary school age kids, there's an advocacy effort that can be undertaken that I think we're kind of on the verge of that being really, really necessary for parents to understand that, like, you're buying a car for your teenager. Like, your kid is 5, but you're buying a car for your teenager. And also getting the word out that there are resources to help parents make safer choices for their teens, even if they can't buy the safest car.
Steve, if I could I just wanted to follow up on 2 things
Sure.
that Becca said. So yeah, we think that regardless of your price point, you should have the best brakes. And that's, you know, another benefit of getting the, you know, this vehicle safety technology as standard equipment and required in all vehicles. And if we, you know, if we can have that happen now, then these vehicles that are handed down will come with the vehicle safety technology on them. And, you know, just talking about, you know, today's teen new drivers are sort of at a hybrid point, you know, and there's likely some utility in having them learn on both a vehicle that has crash avoidance technology and a vehicle that doesn't have all the bells and whistles. So they really learn how to use a rear view mirror and side view mirrors and, you know, to be attentive, you know, at all times. So, you know, just like, you know, we, during the process, try to ensure they're driving during the day and at night, in snow and in rain, maybe the different types of vehicle capability should be added to that list as well.
You know, Tara, I am somewhat between you and Pam. My first teen driver is now a 33-year-old police officer, and my second one starts driving next year. So I am in truly panic mode. And fortunately, for my youngest daughter, she won't get the drill sergeant treatment that my son got. But it's really a hard decision.
Well, the thing to remember is that this is the last time you'll have a chance to spend concentrated time with that kid. The more hours you spend with them behind the cars, the more one-on-one time you get with them. Because once they get the keys to the car, they're gone. And rather than taking them places, you'll be saying goodbye as they leave. So enjoy it while you can. So, but yeah, Tara, to go back to your point, yes, and NTSB has likewise recommended and urged in any variety of contexts that we need to adopt many of these automated systems. As I'm sure Kenny can tell you, we've seen lots of instances though where the systems didn't necessarily work as drivers might have anticipated. They didn't recognize the pedestrian or the pedestrian walking a bicyclist across the street or some other peculiar object. So it's important. I also have to share, and this perhaps reflects my old age, but I too learned to drive at a time, sort of an inflection point in driving technology, because when I learned to drive, I had to learn on both a standard transmission and an automatic transmission. I suspect today very few teenagers would have any idea how to use a standard transmission car. But that kind of transition is going to be going on, and cars 10 years from now will look very, very different, I suspect, than what they do today in a variety of different ways. So, Becca, let me go back to you and ask, what other research are you all involved in? What else are you finding, or what questions are you looking at in terms of teen drivers?
Good question. So what the research has established pretty concretely as graduated licensing legislation was coming out, 10, 15 years ago, as it was kind of in a hot period, is that GDL seems to work pretty heavily by limiting the exposure to risky situations. So you have a high risk driver and you limit their risk by limiting their exposure to the riskiest of situations, by limiting their exposure to nighttime driving when they're tired or when the visibility is low. You limit their exposure to other teens, their peers in the car with them to distract them and to take them off task. And you make sure that they're only driving when they have attained an age where they're, ostensibly mature enough to be able to manage the complex situations that arise on a roadway. The kind of it's not a hole in the literature, but the thing that was a little bit less certain in the literature was the value of supervised practice driving. And I think anybody who has driven with a teenager as they learn to drive will acknowledge that, you observe them developing skills over time, and they're a better driver when they, complete those supervised practice driving hours than they were when they started. But quantifying that is very difficult to do because there is so much individual variability. So the support for that in the literature, in the scientific literature, just kind of is not as strong as it is for some other components. And some of the literature that has come out of other countries has been the strongest support for the necessity of supervised practice driving. But for those, say in Australia, there were some studies that showed that you get the benefit out of supervised practice driving when you get, 100 to 120 hours. And the most required by any state in the US is 70. So we're not quite getting there, but we still, have this belief that supervised practice driving is really important. So what we're starting to try to quantify right now with a study that I'm doing in collaboration with Johns Hopkins, a bunch of researchers at Johns Hopkins, is we're trying to kind of characterize what supervised practice driving looks like and then link it to things like kinematic risky driving events. So hard braking, hard accelerating, hard turning, things that can and often do result in crashes for teens who lose control of their vehicles. And then we'll track this kind of longitudinally to see how it relates to crash outcomes and violations over time. So over the first couple of years of driving. And we're hoping to identify things that are beneficial and create lower risk drivers, and things that are kind of things to avoid that, perhaps are linked to higher risk situations. So that's kind of the question right now is what kind of the quality over quantity issue with supervised practice driving. What kind of quality do you need to get? And the broad answer is variety. Teens need exposure to lots of different driving conditions when they are supervised so that they can handle them when they are not supervised. So now the question is kind of what that looks like.
Yeah, supervised driving raises lots of questions and issues. And even when we first adopted, our NTSB first adopted its first recommendation, we struggled with that portion of it. How long should we recommend a supervised driving period be? It was a radical new concept. We got a lot of pushback from parents who said, this is going to be impossible for us to do. It's going to take time. I'm busy. I haven't got time to do this. And in fact, I suspect, although I don't know that there's any research, that oftentimes the supervised driving that's done these days is not necessarily the quality we would want. But even many that 20 years ago, it was our perception that it probably would take a couple of 100 hours for a driver to get enough experience to be able to recognize potentially risky situations and know how to respond to them. For those of you who live in the Washington, D.C. area, my experience with my two daughters was I took each of them out and made them drive a complete 360-degree loop with the Capitol Beltway. And they got they came back terrified. They got lots of different driving experiences from that. So, but what are people, how do we get parents more engaged, and how do we get parents to take the supervised driving requirement more seriously rather than just check the box or sign off on it because I haven't got time to really do this?
I mean, I think one element that could help is create through this research, hopefully we'll come up with some concrete benchmarks, concrete suggestions. So instead of just saying like drive with them in all conditions, and then you kind of have to be on every time that a trip could be taken, and it creates too many variables and too many questions and too much flexibility. If you impose a little bit of structure or some suggestions, I think that it could make the process easier for the parents who are overwhelmed by the process.
Yeah, I mean, I had lots of fun with it. We came up with lots of creative places to drive to, but I have the feeling not all parents are the same as somebody like me who lives in this world. So
we're the exception, not the norm when it comes to being parents, because we are living and breathing this issue every day. So we're making time, and that is the challenge. Families do have to make time. I go back to, what can we do to help educate parents, give them that guidance they need. And I know, Bill, the AAA Foundation has done research on, that interaction between teens and parents when they're behind the wheel and then that practice phase and what that looks like. And there's so much emphasis on, teaching your teen how to steer and brake and, stop and start, the acceleration piece, but there's not a real focus on the higher order skills, which we know are so critical and that really help them better recognize risk and to know the kinds of actions they need to take. And so, not to take over for you, Steve, but I'd love to hear from Bill about that work that's going on, because I think that's so critical. And how do we get that information out to parents to really help them, because they are their teen's #1 driving teacher and coach. We know that.
Right. And I think that's where driver education, the infrastructure of that nationally, can help play a role. Whether the parent attends a formal parent session or not, usually they're having some sort of interaction with the driving school. And it's in the driving school's interest to get some information across to the parents as well, if nothing else, about their own policies for rescheduling drives, that sort of thing. So there's a link there that almost every driving school is going to have. And that's a great opportunity for the school to help the parent understand how to do and what to do and what not to do during practice driving. It's also an opportunity to help parents understand the importance of doing that to start. So if we have great advice on how to do it well, but the parent never picks up on the importance of actually doing it, it really doesn't move forward. And driving schools generally are happy to convey that information. And a lot of schools would love for their state to require that sort of official parent night, parent session, if you will. And that's often hearing back from driving schools where parents truly learn about the components of their state's GDL system. For some reason, little Johnny learns it, but for some reason that doesn't make it home to the parent. So the information getting to the parent from the driving school can be very effective. And a lot of parents are like, wow, I had no idea. This isn't how I learned to drive. Well, things have changed, and we're here to help you and be your partner to do that.
Yeah, I would add to that too. Can I add to that, Steve?
Yeah.
Just one thing. When I was going through this with my son, and I was the primary coach for him, He preferred me over Dad because Dad tended to bark at him when he was behind the wheel. Bill will laugh when he hears that, I'm sure. But yeah, that's what he said. I don't like how Dad corrects me. You correct me nicer than Dad does. But I'd never done this before. You know, I had never taught someone how to drive. And so I made it a point to spend time with my son's driving school instructor and say, help me understand, what should I be doing? How do I be a better coach? And he was my son's teacher was very amenable to that, very gracious, and spent some time with me. And so I think that's another piece of this, is we need parents to understand that person, that driving school instructor, is there to help them too. As Bill said, it's not just about, they're going to be teaching your teen for a very limited period of time, but you're then going to take over in that role and need to build upon those basic things that they learned and continue to coach and monitor. So use those folks, use those professionals to help you learn, how do I best do this? And don't be afraid to go back to them for additional guidance as you continue to work with your team. They're there to help you. That's really, really important.
A lot of driving schools would have a standing invitation to parents to, hey, come sit in the back seat during one of our formal behind the wheel sessions. You can watch me as the instructor, teach your teen. And parents are just blown away. Those that take advantage of that, they're, wow, this is great. I had no idea how difficult it was, but I really picked up a lot with 45-minute time investment. For the rest of that 50, 60, 70 hours, that small investment of time, that's a high rate of return. That they're preparing parents very well to do that.
Yeah,
Steve, I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Ken.
Sure. Sorry, Steve, I have a question that maybe Bill or Rebecca can address. How do insurance providers provide incentives for parents to provide more training or more technology for young drivers? Because when I think about my son's car, his insurance costs far more than a car did. So, I mean, money is always the carrot on the stick. So is that a possible initiative that will take traction?
So as a rule, I don't tend to know what happens with insurance companies, just because we keep things pretty separate. So every company is going to do something different, and I know most of them do offer incentives. Some of them involve completing driver education before a certain time. Some of them, I as a rule, I tend to not know.
I'm happy to jump in here because of my programs that we've done with State Farm and some other insurance providers. They have apps that they have developed to make available to parents of teen drivers that provide in-vehicle coaching and other information. So there are services available through insurance companies, and if you complete these, they will give you a discount. They will do things for you. So I always say to parents, you need to be not only work with your teen's driving teacher, driving instructor, but also talk to your insurance company. How can they help you? This is a huge expense. What services and what apps, what things do they have available that you can take advantage of? Parents shouldn't just rely on those things. They should be using a variety of things, but there are insurance companies that have these that are readily available. And there is an incentive to complete them, and there is a discount provision often associated with them.
Just wanted to add that advocates recently pushed out a statement on Teen Driver Safety Week, and it's on our website at saferoads.org. And at the bottom of the statement, we have a lot of links to our board members, who half of our board is the country's leading insurer, to their teen driver safety programs and information. So that might be a resource and a good follow-up to your question, Kenny.
Great, thank you.
Sure, that's an excellent question. I'm glad you asked. In a related vein, should states be imposing some requirements on parents as part of the graduated driver licensing system?
Yes. Get educated. I can't overstate that. I mean, I think the two provisions in graduated driver's licensing that specifically speak to parents, actually there's more than that. One is giving them some minimum information in terms of what Tara said, and I said it before, which is these are the minimum standards to aim for. These are the things that you need to be aware of. But I also think that there's real value in saying, you know, as part of your teen's driver education, you need to get a little education too, a little bit of information so that they understand, why do we have a graduated driver's licensing program? This is not a nanny state issue. This is sound science saying, here's what we know. And if you do these things, your teen abides by these provisions, there's a good chance they're going to, you know, they're going to be okay. We're trying to save lives here. So parents need to understand that. And oftentimes, you know, trying to get them to go to a program voluntarily is really, really difficult. It is. And so I use the example, again, I'm going to speak to, you know, what happens in the state where I've been for so many years. But in New Jersey, we have a parent-teen driving program. It's called Share the Keys. And it was developed through the Highway Safety Office while I was there. And it's now run through the private sector through an insurance company partnership with the state. And it's a voluntary program, but many school systems have made it mandatory for teens to get parking privilege on campus. So the teens come in with mom or dad. It's about an hour to an hour and a half program. And they come in and, you know, the body language is, oh, I have to be here. You know, I'm missing Dancing with the Stars or whatever, you know, and here I am. And, you know, okay, fine. And what's fabulous about this program, and I facilitated it for several years, is they walk out of that program at the end of the night with a lot of tools, a lot of information. There's just so much that they get out of it. And they come up to us as facilitators and say, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Thank you. You know, it's opened up a whole new world for me. I now understand. And, you know, I'm going to be working with my teen on, you know, the provisions, and we're going to create a parent-teen driving agreement, and we're going to require them to ask for the keys and do these things. And so that education piece is important. And I really point to the practice hours piece again. Parents are looking for guidance. And thank you, Rebecca, for saying that, you know, what the research is showing is that, you know, 40, 50, 60, 70 hours is probably not enough. We need a lot more. But these are at least the minimum standards that parents can use, and they need to understand to really move the needle in the right direction. So yeah, I think that parents have to be a part of the requirements under the GDL law, if nothing else, to make sure they have the information they need to make better decisions and help their teens build the necessary skills to become safer drivers.
Yeah, and parents can be resources for each other too. It's important to talk to other parents who are going through the process or have beaten you to the process to see what they picked up along the way. One of the best pieces of advice I got from another mom was to ask your kid to narrate what they're doing while they're behind the wheel. So instead of me in the passenger seat anticipating and worrying, should I remind him that he's got to slow down and the blinker, you know, your young driver is saying, I want to take a right at the next corner. So I'm going to put on my blinker, I'm going to slow down, I'm going to stop, I'm going to look both ways, and then I'm going to turn. And it takes, you know, a lot of pressure off the parent to know when to jump in or not jump in, to startle them for some who are sensitive behind the wheel. And it's also, it helps to assess their executive functioning. You know, that's what driving is. It's really complex functions in a logical order. And by narrating the drive, you can really get a sense of where your child is and being able to do that.
Yeah, it's important to recognize that driving is not so much about the physical skill of manipulating the vehicle as the executive skill of recognizing and anticipating. So are we aware of any states that either offer incentives or requirements for parents' participation? In New Jersey, Pam, is it a state mandate or?
No, it's not a state mandate in New Jersey. But as I said before, there are a handful of states that do require, as part of their GDL programs, that parents participate in a program. In some cases, they have to do it with their teen. And I think that is the way to do it. The teens and parents are together learning about some critical behavioral objectives that really can make a difference. And there, you know, I think it's important, but there is just a handful of states that do it. And there has been a movement for 2 decades now to incorporate that parent education piece into graduated driver's licensing laws. So I think that's another area where I'd love to see us make some more inroads. And if not, again, get creative. As I said, in our state, we have many high schools that have said, okay, if you want to park on campus, if you want to get a bid to the prom this year, you have to come to a parent-teen education night, and you're going to learn about GDL, and you're going to learn some other things that will help you as you go through this this very dangerous driving period.
At the risk of putting you on the spot, are there any states that stand out as having particularly effective programs that would serve as a model for others?
I point to some of the work that they've done in Connecticut with their parent education program, and it's been evaluated several times, and they've definitely seen an increase in awareness. I know they were going to retool the program a few years ago, so I greatly appreciate that. I also point to Virginia is the only state in the country that has their licensing ceremony. I don't know how many folks are familiar with that, but in order to get your driver's license, you have to appear before a judge with a parent or guardian, and the gravity of what this means is really conveyed to the teen, and the license is handed to the parent, and the parent in turn hands the license to the teen. And that to me, I think is terrific, because it really says to that teen, this is a big deal. And it says to mom and dad, you play a critical role in this. This is the beginning, not the end. You may have been there coaching and training, but it's not over yet. And I think, not to, again, to belabor the point about the parent piece, but I also think that, the graduated driver's licensing program, once they get through that permit phase, that learning to drive phase, it hasn't ended. They have to stay actively involved throughout that intermediate provisional probationary phase where the teen can drive without supervision, but they have these restrictions. And it's, making time to continue to go out and drive with your teen to see how they're doing, to see if they are developing some more of those higher order skills. So that's really important. And I would say to parents, stay engaged. There's tremendous research that was done by Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that holds up today that says teens that have involved parents are less likely to crash, and they're less likely to engage in risky driving behaviors. Things like driving distracted, driving impaired, not wearing their seatbelt. And so we have to understand that, parental involvement is key.
Yeah, I just wanted to affirm what Pam said. GDL is a period of time for us to target safe driving behaviors for our novice drivers, but it by no means is the entire learning period. Younger children are in the back seat watching us to see if we're putting on our seatbelts, if we're using our phones, are we, getting irate behind the wheel, are we speeding? So they're taking it all in leading up to the GDL process. And then, once your teen gets that driver's license, that provisional license where they're able to drive independently, they can, but it doesn't mean they have to. If it's sort of it takes a village. If you hear from a friend that they were, speeding down a road, or they had a bunch of kids in the car, definitely that's an opportunity to step in and say, we thought you were ready to drive independently, but we've since found out that, maybe you're not. This is serious business. So, being engaged throughout the whole process, starting from when they're little, is terribly important.
Yeah, and that's a tough thing to do. So I'd like to shift a little bit and talk more about a system safety approach. Our chair, Jennifer Homedy, has been leading a series of events looking at the system safety approach to reducing crashes or highway safety in general. And I'd be interested to know your thoughts about what elements of system safety are most important or most relevant to young teen drivers. If we look at this whole broad approach of vehicles, highways, operators, emergency response, and the like, where does this most affect teenage drivers?
I'll just jump in to say, I think, curbing speed is a huge component of the safe system approach. And that's going to help teens as well as all the other road users that are, on the roadway with them. Because of inexperience and lack of skill, when you're going higher speed, there's less opportunity to make corrections or to understand a potential hazard that's coming up. So, speed curbing measures will be particularly helpful for teen drivers.
I want to echo that. We released a report earlier in the year regarding teens and speeding and how they are definitely overrepresented in fatal crashes. This is a huge problem. As teens gain more experience behind the wheel and they get more comfortable, you tend to see the speeds go up. And at the same time, they're still learning, they're less risk adverse, the maturity isn't there, so they don't necessarily recognize the unsafe conditions that are inappropriate for the speeds they may be traveling. So we certainly see teens more than any other age group overrepresented in speeding related fatalities. And we need to really understand that. And that's a key component of the safe systems approach for sure. I think the other thing, and we talked about it before, is the vehicle. The more we can get teens in cars that have those safety features that are going to protect them, they're going to protect other road users, the better. That is important. But I also go back to some really fundamental stuff, and that is the role of the person in the system themselves. And I know there's a big focus on, making the roadways as forgivable as possible because we make mistakes and so forth. But we need our teen drivers to understand the awesome responsibility that comes with being a driver and what it means to be a safe driver and a lawful driver, and to recognize what are those risky behaviors that are really putting other folks at risk. So they need to understand the laws, and parents need to be positive role models to their teens. So if we're going to get teens to slow down and not speed, we need moms and dads to not speed. And that's a problem we have in this country. It's a huge problem. We need to make sure that everybody buckles up every time. So it's understanding those things which come with driver education, that come with reinforcement from parents being positive role models. And something that was said to me years ago when I was doing some research on a report for GHSA, and that I've used ever since, is that I say this a lot, but be the driver you want your teen to be. And I think every parent wants their teen to be a safe driver, a responsible driver, a driver that understands that, I need to not only be thinking about myself, but everybody else out there on the road, because the decisions that I make will have a ripple effect. So long answer to your question, Steve, but I think there are so many components of this that are critical. And I'll end with the fact that law enforcement is also a very important part of the safe systems approach. So if a teen is violating the provisions of the law or engaging in other risky behaviors that are putting other folks at risk, we need law enforcement to be out there and to make that traffic stop, and to help and make sure that teen understands what they're doing and how dangerous it can be for themselves and others. Really important.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that, the goal of any good traffic safety law is deterrence. It's not more tickets. It's not, collecting fines. It's deterring the dangerous driving behavior. But when a traffic stop does need to occur, it's a tremendous opportunity to educate. And I know a lot of dedicated law enforcement officers will take that opportunity to say, did you know you were speeding? You were speeding. Here's why it's so important to, stay within the speed limit. So, I definitely agree with Pam that the enforcement of the state traffic safety laws are a component in the way we move forward. And just going back to the infrastructure piece too, I think, the safe system approach considers all road users, not just the vehicles. And that's an important point to get across to teens as well. They may be driving, but the bicyclist, the pedestrian, everybody in the environment is equally as important, and they are responsible because the vehicle they're driving has the capacity to do tremendous harm.
Right. And I would add that is a major push within driver education in terms of curriculum development, is to greatly expand the emphasis on sharing the road, vulnerable road users, helping teens understand all the different types of vehicles and users that will be out there. We've always had that in curriculums, but we're greatly expanding it, certainly. And we're going to see all sorts of new types of vehicles, cargo bikes, all sorts of things probably in the future. We're going to have a huge mix of vehicles, some with very little technology, some with a whole lot, and eventually, partial self-driving, and it's going to be a very different environment. So right now is the time to start building then those expectations of sharing the road safely.
Steve, I think another important element, especially for young drivers, is for them to develop good driving habits early. Things such as just ordinary speed maintenance, or keeping a follow distance, or scanning the intersection. I mean, these are skills that really come into play when the unexpected happens. So, establish them when they're early. And that's part of the reason for traffic enforcement, is to help you, recognize I made a mistake, I need to change this behavior. And if we can do that, we set the team up to have a good long driving history.
Great. Well, thank you. Bill, since you talked a little bit about changing curriculum in driver ed, let me shift the discussion a little bit to focus more on driver education. What is the state of driver education today? What are the significant trends? What are driver education schools doing? What are the variations among schools in different parts of the country?
Well, the good news is that there's more excitement and energy in driver education than there has been in the last 40 years. And that's actually largely because of NTSB's efforts. There was a crash out west a few years ago where an instructor and driving students were killed. Everybody lost their life. And NTSB motivated NHTSA to bring together stakeholders to eventually create a set of national standards for driver education. Not just content standards, but standards for states to use and how to administer driver education. And those have existed now for 12 years. We're currently revising them. So this will be the third version of those. So thanks to NTSB, that really got things moving. As Pam and Tara mentioned, many times out of tragedy can come opportunity. Although it is a little tricky because there's no such thing as national driver education. So to your point, variability, every state does it differently. That's the harder part, is convincing states to adopt and use the national standards rather than having created them. Difficult to create, but even more difficult to get states to adopt them. But at least if you're just looking only at the content requirements, a lot of states are way behind on that. They're not keeping their content requirements up to date. So why not just adopt the national standards? They're current. If we look just in the area of vehicle technology, there's some states that currently list only anti-lock brakes as the only vehicle technology that you have to cover in driver education. That's completely unacceptable. If this were 1990s, that's fine, but these states are 25, 30 years behind. And when they do update their standards for content, it's another 10, 12, 15, 20 years before they touch them again. So there's some good reasons for states to be looking into these standards.
Should there be a national requirement? Should NHTSA, for example, or somebody adopt a national equivalent of the FMVSS?
Well, we've got a lot of people asking for that. So, well, if the federal government were to withhold funds like they did for other situations, but I don't see a great appetite for that. But having more consistency would be very good. We've got some programs that are 30 hours in length, some that are up to 50, some are only 8 hours. Can you imagine only 8 hours and you're ready to go drive a car? There's so much room for opportunity there. And so that, I'd say that's a trend. Another trend would be vehicle technology, the much greater focus on vehicle technology and introducing novice drivers, not only to specific technologies, but to develop the habit of learning about whatever car you're about to drive for the rest of your life. So if we learn about today's technologies, that is great. But we also need to prompt new drivers of all ages, to be ready to drive tomorrow's technologies as well, and not just assume they understand how they work.
Like I said, I learned to drive on a standard transmission, which today is not terribly relevant to my driving experience.
Right, right.
So what do others think about the idea of national driver ed standards being mandated?
I think it's going to be a challenge because we've seen states pull back from their investment in driver education in some places. Again, I can speak specifically to New Jersey because of my many years there, but we still require teens in almost all high schools to complete classroom driver education, a 30-hour program, and it's actually been built into as part of the safety strand and the core curriculum content standards. So that's another way to do it, is to get it in there. And what's happened is it's become a requirement in schools to graduate, from high school. You've got to complete these pieces of it, and that includes driver education. So I think that's important. But one of the things that I would point to that I think states, I would encourage states to look at is there's free technical assistance available to your state to really look at how are you doing with driver education. And they also will look at your GDL program. It's a very comprehensive look. And it's available free. It's available through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So take advantage of that. If you're a driver educator, if you're leading programs, if you're an advocate, if you're involved with your highway safety office or other groups, AAA, whoever it might be, take a look at the opportunity to bring this into your state and have a group of independent experts look at your program and provide some of those recommendations based on the national standards that have been developed that Bill talked about. They use that as their guidance document and really give you some things to work on. Recently happened in my state, and they're now using that to move the needle and to really strengthen the programs, to work with the driver education community, work with the Department of Education and the Motor Vehicle Commission. So it's all those people are now at the table and they're talking to each other and they're working together. And that's vitally important because there are many agencies that touch this. Teen driving is, it is your education department. It is your licensing agency. Your highway safety office is involved. AAA clubs play a role in this. There are lots of groups that need to come to the table. Your driving schools. There's lots of folks. So if you can get them all around the table working together, take advantage of this technical assistance, it can really make a difference. You could move the needle in a very positive direction.
And Pam, I would add that not only do these types of assessments help get things moving within the state, they're also bringing opportunities for states to talk to each other once they've gone through that similar experience there or maybe interested about that. And NHTSA has been providing incredible support to hosting in-person and virtual meetings among state administrators to get together and talk about best practices and challenges. Well, we're facing this in this state. How did you deal with that? Oh, we had 3 things that worked for us, or we haven't solved that yet, et cetera. So we're starting to see a larger and larger national network of driver education administrators moving things forward. It's slow, but it's steady, but it's moving ahead. It's not a nationally top-down type of initiative, but it is happening at the state level. Still a few states not there yet, but we're working on that.
I know the challenge that you're going to get in from the educational community is we have limited resources and a lot of priorities, and where do we allocate the valuable but limited amount of time in particular that we have for teaching students? And that's going to be a very large challenge, I suspect, in dealing with the educational community.
It has been for a long time, and we've seen a trend of driver education moving away from public funding out of the high schools. But some good news is a couple of the associations just did some surveys of their members, the professional driver ed organizations, and found that a lot of that has been moving to private driving schools, and parents seem to be okay with that. About 80%, 75, 80% of driver ed seems to be, to our best estimate, delivered by private schools now. Even if it's delivered at the high school location, oftentimes that's delivered by a private organization. But in the parents' eyes, it's still connected to the education. So it's sort of a nice blend, a hybrid model there. The parent has the confidence of the high school-based program, The high school doesn't have maybe the risks that some private organizations are willing to take, and it's growing.
Yeah, and let me add one other thing too that I think is important, and that is really how we communicate to parents about this issue and talk about it as a life skill and as a health and safety issue. And that's what I found has been very effective too. If you, and talking to school boards as well, when you talk about this from a health and safety perspective as part of your health curriculum in schools, schools all have health curriculums, they do, and they have health and PE, but to really incorporate it or keep it as a part of that can make a huge difference. And it really, when you start to talk about the data and, the fatalities and so forth, and you make it a health and public safety issue, it does resonate with folks. Thank you. I can't say that word today, resonate with folks, I'm struggling. But I think that's really important, is how you convey this to folks too, and why it's so vitally important.
So we've, I think, pretty much talked through the issue of how do driver ed schools get parents more engaged, but that strikes, coming back to that, is just critically important that there be an alliance, in essence, between the driver ed schools and the parents in order to get the kids the experience they need. So Becca's talked some about the research that's going on in that area, and we certainly hope that something concrete will come of that, and look forward to seeing that sometime soon. So let me pursue one other sort of very short-term question related to driver education, which has to do with the current COVID-19 pandemic. How are schools changing their practices in the light of the pandemic we've lived with for the last year and a half? And are there changes that are going to that have come out of that will continue on into the future once we return to whatever the new normal is?
Sure. Well, like many other industries, COVID affected kind of shocked the driver ed community, and pretty quickly they responded. Just shutting all programs down completely wasn't really an option. And so most states started to transition to allow live virtual classroom, like we're doing here through Zoom and other systems. So in a large part, after a few weeks, maybe a month and a half, a lot of states said, we're going to have an emergency declaration. We're going to allow this to continue. So in effect, driver ed was able to continue. The behind the wheel component, that's been trickier. Obviously, you've got people in enclosed situations there, and that there's a backlog there. Some organizations have figured out safer ways to do that, but that's still, driving schools are still kind of playing catch up there, if you will. And to your point about what might stay with us in terms of those adjustments, some states have found that driving schools and students and families really like the virtual classroom. So some states are very seriously thinking, let's just keep that going. It's not online, it's not in person, but it's live virtual. And that seems to be a nice overlap for a lot of states. Second, I think some states are more willing to explore modern educational technologies, simulation, if you will, maybe not to replace behind the wheel, but to supplement that, things that can be done one-on-one with a computer. And that might be something straightforward like hazard anticipation training, or something more advanced like virtual reality. There's some pilot tests going around the US in terms of, can virtual reality be used to train hazard perception skills or demonstrate why driving distracted is risky? Or can VR help drivers use technologies before they ever get behind the wheel to start getting some experience there? So those are a couple of examples of how COVID has affected the industry and some opportunities that might yield going forward.
Yeah, I know.
Steve?
Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to jump in while we're still on the driver education piece, just to give a different perspective on one component. And just as, at Advocates, we feel, vehicle safety technology, or as I said, the best brakes should be available to everyone. If driver education is a pay for, it may alienates, parts of the community who aren't able to pay for it or who will have to make tough choices. And additionally, we have the concern because we've seen some states put these provisions in their laws that if a student completes driver education, they don't have to complete as many supervised driving hours. And we really feel it's that behind the wheel time that yields the most benefit and, is backed more by research than classroom education.
Yeah, there are some definite challenges there in terms of equity of access. And perhaps we should be looking at the potential impacts of live virtual and online options, at least for the theory, not to replace the behind the wheel, but for the theory side of things, is can that help us reach either the underserved or the areas of the country, maybe quite rural or frontier, where no in-person provider is available right there. So there may be some opportunities to expand our reach using modern technologies.
It strikes me there are a number of tricky questions there that perhaps are beyond the scope of our discussion today, but would need to be addressed. So, but yeah, I was going to raise concern about the fact that not everybody can afford to pay for a high quality driver education program with all the bells and whistles. And the question is who pays for it? And I'm not about to try and answer that question today. So, but it does seem like there are some technological developments out there that could make a big difference in the way kids are taught. Tara, I was going to ask you, it seems like I have seen a couple of bills in states this year that would have changed either driver ed or GDL requirements as in response to the COVID pandemic itself. I think you mentioned one option, but have you seen many or much of that sort of thing, like suspending or reducing the supervised driving requirement?
Well, last year we saw a bunch of states reconsider their on-the-road testing. And sort of, there was a little bit of an outcry and then they dialed it back a bit. But then, right now, just last week, I saw that a bill had dropped in Wisconsin to no longer require on-the-road testing. Wisconsin's had a pilot program going on for the last couple of years where parents would, sign something, certify that their child's they feel their child's ready to advance. So, from our perspective, we push back on that, taking away the on-the-road testing requirement. And the reason was because without another assessment in place, they're just taking it away without saying, well, here's how we're going to assess minimum skills readiness to give them that license to drive independently. We're all for making changes, but let's ensure that the safety need is met in the process. So there has to be some kind of similar assessment of the, teens' readiness to go from, driving with adult supervision to independently. And that's, the on-the-road test is just that minimum capacity to check the box, like that they know how to do certain things. So definitely saw some of that in COVID, some attempts in states to weaken existing GDL provisions. Like, for example, one that went through was in North Carolina. They reduced their learners phase from 9 to 6 months, which
that was the one I was thinking. That's the one that caught my attention. Yeah,
we felt was going, in the wrong direction, unfortunately. And even, I was thinking about the conversation today about, how much opportunity there is to upgrade GDL laws. And at the same time, we're trying to retain GDL laws. And then new issues are, coming to play, like, teens delaying licensure and, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, AAA, and GHSA have done, you know, great reports on that phenomena. And I'll bring myself into the mix again. We're also living that at my house, where my teens are, you know, older novice drivers, but because DC requires you to go through GDL as an older novice driver, we're still going through the program. And I'm so grateful that I live somewhere that does require GDL for these novices over 18. So that's something we're going to be seeing, you know, I think states take a look at more closely. And we've been trying to get a measure in California across the finish line for the last probably 4 years or so that would extend that state's GDL requirements to, you know, to up to 20-year-olds.
Yeah, that I just want, if I can piggyback off of that just for a second. I think it's really important to understand that, you know, we have teens who are waiting and they age out of the system. They age out of the GDL program. And so I think it's unfortunate because they're not getting that opportunity to really drive with that exposure to less risk and so forth. My state of New Jersey is the only state other than Maryland where all drivers have to go through some form of graduated driver's license. And you can be 40 years old and you still have to have a minimum holding period for a permit and a probationary license. And so I think it's really important. It sends a very strong message that regardless of age, you know, inexperience is a problem if you've never driven before. You know, with teens, we know it's inexperience coupled with maturity and the brain development. But for older folks who may have not have driven before, there's an inexperience factor here at play. But I am concerned about states where teens do wait and they age out of their graduated driver's license system, and then they're not getting that benefit. And Rebecca, I think you guys have looked at this at the Insurance Institute, and I think it's really important for states to understand that there is, you know, something at play here.
I was going to ask, what's your experience?
So what we found, studies that we've done and studies that other people have done about like the reasons why people delay licensure, because there are plenty of teenagers who will just wait until, you know, they're well over 18. And the primary reason behind that isn't because they're trying to avoid GDL, it's because they don't have access. It's because it's expensive. Right. You know, maybe they wanted to get a license, but they wouldn't have a car once they did, and they couldn't afford the insurance even if they did have a car. So they don't see a point. Or they, you know, maybe they live in an urban environment where they have a lot of public transit or things are close by and they can use other methods of transportation to get around. But it's really an access issue. So the kind of one of the $1 million questions is something that we've kind of been dancing around that I don't think any of us really have a good answer to, but it is an issue that will be a research issue. And I think it will also be a logistical and policy issue going forward is, you know, how do we make it inclusive and accessible for people? Because, you know, maybe if you have a program that, you know, supplements the cost of driver education and on-road practice for, you know, somebody who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it, maybe that gives them access. But then, you know, they would have to do like, what do we do with teenagers or even younger, you know, or older novice drivers who don't have a licensed driver in their life that can supervise their practice driving? And there are all of these elements that are, you know, there are bigger questions that the research, and this is part of the issue with research like this, like we have big data sets that we can study, and then when we study people, when we actually have participants that we study during different stages of driving, they have to volunteer for that. So we necessarily have the selection bias that, you know, it doesn't make the studies invalid, but it necessarily kind of skews the results towards parents who are going to be willing to participate and are already interested. And even there, you know, you get people who sign up thinking they're interested and then they don't follow through, or they don't have as much time as they thought they did. So the attrition, even among parents who were interested and very concerned, and teens that were willing to participate, like participation isn't 100%. So we have a population that is very difficult to study and very difficult to reach. And I think, you know, we have studied the low-hanging fruit, and now we need to go to the things that are a little harder to reach.
Yeah, and just anecdotally, there does seem to be a trend towards more and more young people deferring getting their licensure for whatever reason. And to to me, that is an important question going forward, is what do we do about integrating them into the driving process? Do we, as I suspect we should, require them to go through a graduate licensing process or some sort of process, or do we give them a break because presumably they're older and more mature and not the risk takers that 16 and 17-year-olds are? So
yeah, there is some data that shows that the crash risk among new drivers does drop off as those new drivers age. So the crash risk for a brand new novice 25-year-old driver is much lower than it is for a brand new novice 16-year-old driver, but it is still elevated up until I think about age 25 when they start.
Yeah, and there are a few states now that are trying to address that, not so much from the GDL side, but more from the driver education side, like Texas. As if you are learning to drive between, or want to get your license between the ages 18 and 24 now, you still have to take driver education. It's a smaller version. It's a 6-hour classroom course, but it's harder to age out of the whole thing because there's another 6-year span where, okay, going to at least learn some rules of the road, have some opportunity to influence their driving. So it's not the whole ball of wax. It's not all the GDL there, but it would be, like you say, that'll be something to research and see how that's affecting students. Maybe some students, well, if it's going to be another 6 years before I get licensed, I might as well get my license now, or maybe not.
interesting. Well, that's, I think, something that's going to develop over the next few years as we see changes in social trends. So as we get close to the end of our time together, and we've had a very wide-ranging discussion that's touched upon a lot of different topics. I just wanted to ask each of you to take a minute or so to share what you consider a key takeaway from our lesson towards what's the important thing we need to do in order to reach this goal of 0 deaths for teen drivers that Nick talked about at the very beginning. And Pam, since you're in the top left corner of my screen, I'm going to start with you.
Going to say I'm not in the top left on my screen, but okay, no problem. I'm happy to kick us off here. I think the one thing is we really can't diminish the important role of parents in this. You know, graduated driver's license laws are really parent programs that are designed to give them those standards, minimum standards to shoot for. I think that's really important, and we have to make sure that they understand that and really leverage GDL for all it's worth, because it is a proven tool. It's the most effective tool we have in the toolbox. I mean, I think that's number one. Number two is, I think, as we started this conversation, that is that, you know, we're not done. The job when it comes to our programs, our GDL programs, our GDL laws, is far from complete. And as folks like Rebecca and others who are doing research, you know, learn what is working and what isn't working and so forth, how can we leverage that and make our laws as strong as possible so that we're giving parents those key things that they can do and capitalize on to keep their teens safe? And I'll finish by saying that, you know, I truly believe that, you know, as parents, what they have to understand is that, you know, they've spent the first 15, 16, some cases, I know they can get their permits at 14 in states, which makes me nervous, but they've spent those first formidable years of their child's life, you know, nurturing, educating, clothing, doing everything they can to protect their child. And then the state says, okay, it's fine, you can get a driver's license, your teen can get a driver's license. And we just kind of, not all, but many parents kind of toss the keys and say, I'm free, amen, I'm free, I don't have to do this anymore. And this is the one thing that absolutely will impact your child in a terrible way. It can seriously injure and kill them. And so we need parents to understand that. And so I say leverage GDL for all it's worth, learn about it, use it, be that parent, be that driver you want your teens to be, and let's keep working to improve our laws so parents have the guidance they need.
Great, thanks. Tara, you're next on my screen.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Overall, I'd say, you know, I think we've identified that there's some complacency, and we've lost momentum on taking action to improve safety for novice drivers. But the fact remains that crashes are a leading cause of death for teens, and it shouldn't be acceptable that thousands are killed each year in crashes with involving a teen driver. So, you know, just in thinking about it, sometimes the answers to problems are right in front of us. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just might need to put in the work and really get some momentum behind it. So traffic safety laws, along with vehicle safety technology, requirements and standards, and road safety upgrades, this is the package we should be looking at to achieve what I think is the ultimate goal of all of us, to end fatalities on our roads. GDL laws have been proven to be effective in improving novice driver safety and saving lives. And while all states have some aspect of a GDL program, no state has all of the optimal components. So there's a lot of opportunity there. So from advocates' perspective, we would urge all the states to give their GDL program a second look, give it a fresh look, know the research and the best practices, and prioritize changes to improve the programs. Each year we put out our roadmap of state highway safety laws, which is on our website at saferoads.org, and it has a great section on novice driver safety and key components of an optimal law. So that can be a resource for legislators and advocates in states. So I think by coming together and working with our safety partners, we can get some of these upgrades over the finish line for sure. And before I pass the mic on to whoever's next on your screen, Steve, I just wanted to say thank you to NTSB for convening the panels on novice driver safety, and to wish you a great next adventure, whatever that should be after your time at NTSB ends.
Well, thanks. I'm looking forward to it. We'll see what it is.
I bet you are. Well
yes,
earned.
Indeed. Thank you.
Sure.
So Rebecca, your turn.
All right, I could probably talk for a long time, and I won't, because we all have places to be and things to do. So I'm just gonna plug vehicle choice, because it's something that I've spent a fair amount of time researching, and it's something that I think people think about, but they don't realize how big of a role that it plays in their teens' driving safety. And as I pointed out earlier, a lot of parents don't realize that they're making that decision for their teenager when their kid isn't a teenager yet. So there are lots of points of contact for parents and teens as they're going through the process of the teen learning to drive and becoming a licensed driver. And there are any number of places to access parents to tell them, these are the key important things that you need to think about when you're selecting a vehicle for your teen. It needs to be a slightly larger, slightly heavier vehicle with a lower horsepower, so that it will limit their ability to do things that are risky that we know they're probably going to do, and that will place them at a significant risk. And if it's at all possible to put them in a vehicle with advanced safety features, first of all, you as a parent need to understand how they work, and then you need to take the time to teach a teenager how they work. So you can't teach somebody to use something that you don't know how to use yourself. So if you are in a position to give your teenager a more advanced, a vehicle that's equipped with more advanced technology, then you need to understand what it does, how it does it, and what its limitations are before you put your teenager in a vehicle's hands, as it were. And plugging our list of recommended vehicles for teens, we keep price in mind. We have best recommended and good recommended lists with a whole wide range of prices that can be affordable for a lot of different budgets. The most recent iteration that we did was with Consumer Reports, and it's a very comprehensive list that's on our website.
Yeah, and just to reiterate the plug for your website, ihs.org, I believe it is
yes,
a valuable resource on every traffic safety issue that I'm visiting virtually every day. So thank you all.
We update the numbers on the website annually as the FARS data come out. So once we get the 2020 FARS data, we'll have updates, hopefully.
Yeah, whether it be recent tests or state laws updates, which are invaluable, or numbers. It's all remarkably useful. Thank you for that. Kenny Bragg, let me turn to you next and ask, what's your key takeaway or what's your key message?
My key message will be for parents, and that's to become as involved as you can in your child's transition to a motoring adult. What's at stake is beyond what you could imagine. I mean, this can truly lead to tragedy. So you have to take every step you can, give them the education, have those conversations, give them guidelines. I mean, and understand that kids are impulsive. If you don't set them up when they're out there by themselves, they're going to make a mistake. It could be a simple mistake with a tragic result. So while you have the chance, do everything you can to ensure your child's success.
Thank you. Well, that's a critical message. So, and Bill, let me finish with you.
Great. I think my number one choice would probably be the same as Pam and Kenny with parents, but since they've already covered that, I'll select another one, and that is vehicle technology. And to Rebecca's point, that vehicle choice, it's all about vehicle choice, and we need to make sure that our new drivers use the vehicle's technology safely and effectively. It's one thing to get it into their hands, but we have to go the next step as well. They have to be trained to use that. And we know from our studies in biology about the human brain and how long it takes to actually mature, we know that most of these drivers are operating vehicles without a fully developed brain. So there's a great temptation to consume vehicle technologies for a performance benefit rather than for a safety benefit, at least among younger drivers. So to be able to counter that, if you will, they need to use them safely and effectively. And at least in training drivers, I think that's probably going to be perhaps our biggest issue over the next 20 years. And if we can help train new drivers indirectly, maybe we can reach their parents, grandparents, and other experienced drivers as well.
Thank you very much. And thanks to each of you. This has been a great discussion. I've learned a lot myself from listening to each of your perspectives. You've brought a lot to the table. And hopefully this will be a next important step towards reaching our common goal of 0 deaths for teenagers and young adults in their driving experience. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to being in touch with you going forward. And with that, we're adjourned.